Good morning to all our listeners at home and in St. Lucia and in the diaspora and in the whole wide world. This morning, in our 8th episode of Conversations with Dr. Anderson Reynolds, we will be discussing the history and current state of St. Lucian Calypso and the role and importance of Calypso to St. Lucian society. We have with us this morning as our special guest, or rather, we're going to have with us as our special guest, because he hasn't arrived yet, Mr. Embert Charles, to help throw some light on the subject. Mr. Charles is a cultural activist, a student of St. Lucian Calypso. He has done considerable research on St. Lucian Calypso and Caribbean and Calypso in general. And he has recently published a book titled The Reign of Terra, the Mighty Terra, and the Modern Calypso Movement in St. Lucia. Mr. Charles has successfully straddled the non-profit corporate world and the world of art and culture. He is a former executive director of the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunication Authority, ECTEL, and also a former executive director of the Folk Research Center, of which he is now serving as chairman of the board of directors. For those of you who may not be aware, ECTEL is the policy-making branch of the OECS telecommunication infrastructure. Mr. Charles have just arrived, but while we welcome him, let us play, since we are dealing with Calypso, let us play some Calypso as he gets settled.
Criminal sentence from time to time become recidivists from that school of crime. So you see the predicament that is. So investigate conditions inside the jail to eliminate
Mr. Charles, welcome to Conversations. So glad you were able to join us in our discourse on St. Lucian Calypso, of which I must say you are uniquely qualified to discuss.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for welcoming me, and it's my pleasure to be here.
By way of introduction, could you brief our listeners on your involvement in St. Lucian art and culture?
By way of introduction, I have been involved in art and culture in St. Lucia as far back as my school days. Been involved in drama at the A-level college then, under the directorship of Hazel Simmons MacDonald, who was the literature teacher at the time, and she was one who had a drama group going. I've been involved in dance. I was one of the earlier members of the P.T. St. Lucie dance company, and I've been with them for some time before I went off to study at University of the West Indies. And at University of the West Indies in Jamaica, I continued my involvement in arts and culture. I was part of the drama society. I actually directed a couple of plays in a festival called Talawa. I also did some dancing at UE as well. And in fact, while at UE, that's when I got involved in the academic side of arts and culture, because my thesis at the time, what we call the Caribbean Studies, was looking at the impact of Creole in the media in St. Lucia and also in Dominica. And thereafter, when I came back, I continued my involvement in the arts, and then I was recruited by the Folk Research Center to be the first executive director.
Yes.
So and got some training in arts administration and cultural administration, and of course by experience as well. And since then, I've been involved in the Folk Research Center. I've been involved at the national level in cultural management. Actively, I'm a very avid mass player, active engaged in Calypso. I've done a couple of attempts at writing. I haven't given any of my songs. I mean, only recently I shared one of my songs with
a closeted Calypso writer
with Claude Paul, and we were thinking to launch one just before COVID. And at Folk Research Center, my engagement in Calypso started almost immediately, having been one of the key persons facilitating documentation of Calypso, writing, encouraging people to write and publish their works as well. And I mean, this has never stopped. So this is by way of a summary of a background.
Nicely done. I have known you for a while, and I did not know you were so multifaceted. And I didn't, especially, I did not know you were. So you are a closet writer, Calypso composer.
Well, I think it's a bit more than closet. I'm actually the clothes in the closet. But I, very critically used to do some reviews for some of the Calypso writers. When people wrote things, they would sort of call you and ask you, but is that okay? And this sort of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think you have more than made up with your new book. By the way, is this your first book?
Yeah, it is the first published book.
Book?
Yeah.
Well, with your new book, you have more than make up for being a closed Calypso writer. You recently published. That was in January?
No, it was in August 2021.
Oh, how time flies.
Yeah.
So you published the Reign of Terra, the Mighty Terra, and the Modern Calypso Movement in St. Lucia. What motivated you to write the book, and what is it all about?
Well, the motivation is quite simple. As far back as 1992, and I actually walked with this for you to see, it was really 1990 when we FRC started its documentation of Calypso and publishing a magazine called Lucian and Caribbean. And of course, we wanted to sort of set the basis for the foundation of Calypso in St. Lucia. So one of the articles we wrote was on Terra, but we couldn't find Terra. We just knew about Terra. At that time, Terra was involved in he was actually overseas, having migrated to Canada to be a professional. He studied finance, statistics, and economics, and we couldn't find. But we had this story, and Terra became a mystery to everybody, because all we knew is that this guy, this tall, bespectacled guy who composed so many calypsos and won the crown 8 consecutive times, without being any serious challenge. So we had to search for him. So after all of these years, we eventually found Terra. He was back in St. Lucia. He had resettled and so forth. So we decided to continue this story. But essentially, Terra, that story is really a metaphor for the early development of Calypso in St. Lucia.
Okay.
It tells all of the struggles of people who were trying to sing at that time, the class situations. It speaks about the prejudices on culture and so forth. So basically, that was the key motivation for writing and to continue the work on documenting Calypso.
Nice. I read the book in preparation for the interview. I found it very informative. I learned quite a lot that I did not know before. I had never heard of Terra, much less knew that he dominated Calypso for so long. But tell us a bit more about the significance of Terra to St. Lucian Calypso, to St. Lucian culture.
Right. Terra is significant in that Terra was one of those who, to me, was one of the example of transition in Calypso from being stereotyped with lower class people, and also with what we now call the urban inner city areas, which some people call the ghettos and so forth, to giving some respectability, in a sense, if that's a word that is permitted, to Calypso, and bringing in a new class of people to follow and also to support Calypso. He's also significant in that while Calypso was dominated a lot by proponents and Calypsonians from Castries, Terra actually came from Vieux Fort.
Yes.
And Terra's story is almost symbolic of a number of other great Calypsonians who came from Vieux Fort and dominated the Calypso scene. People like the Mighty Terra, people like Zandoli, and also you had others forming the South Calypso Tens. And then you have all other people, even they not from Vieux Fort directly, but from the south, people like Ninctus and Educator and so forth.
Yes, that's interesting because in my previous episode, last week's episode, the conversation was Vieux Fortians are lazy, fact or myth.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I noted was maybe it's a question of whether the glass is half full or half empty. Look here, you are just mentioning the great contribution Vieux Fort has made to Calypso. You talk of Terra. I think Pele is also originally from there.
Yes.
And then we had Driver. I don't think he ever won a national competition, but he dominated the Calypso scene in Vieux Fort.
In the south, yes.
In the south.
Quite correct.
Yes. Very good. So what came to mind about Terra was that he really pioneered the Calypso in St. Lucia.
The modern Calypso. You had the traditional proponents of Calypso, and also there was a group of young bards, as we call them, which were trained by a gentleman called Mr. James Belgrave. But a lot of the Calypsos were not original Calypsos written by themselves.
Oh.
So they would, use a lot of the Trinidad Calypso. Some of them would write simple one verse, one chorus Calypsos, which at the time people used with a lot of up tempo. Some of them using the Trinidad melodies. A lot of these guys actually took up some of the names out of Trinidad, because you remember at that time, our radio was really AM radio, and you were picking up 610 in Trinidad and following the Calypso. So they were influenced a lot by what was happening in Trinidad. But at the same time, as I mentioned in the book, there was the folk tradition, which was also informing our own Calypso in St. Lucia. The folk melodies, the folk approach to call and response and so forth, which I can speak to a little later.
Yes. Well, that piqued my interest in that, because before that I thought, well, we imported Calypso wholesale from Trinidad, and just as we imported pan from Trinidad.
Yes.
But as you said, and in your book, it was mentioned that Calypso was informed by the folk music from the various islands. If so, then in that case, we can assume that St. Lucian Calypso is infused with our folk music. If so, then we may not. Then maybe there is a difference between our Calypso and Trinidad Calypso. What's your sense of that? Is our Calypso different in that it is infused with our unique folk music?
Well, just to go back,
or is that a stretch?
It's not a stretch. It's not a stretch. Some of the early anthropologists, like Alan Lomax, who actually recorded a lot of the folk songs in places like Dennery and the Valley, where people congregated after coming from the plantations.
Yeah.
Was able to identify some of the same structure of a Trinidad Calypso out of that. Now, the argument is whether the influence in Trinidad came from the islands, And that's you know it's still open for research and verification. But what we can certainly say is that the Creole society in the Caribbean, which was the mixture of the French and the English, is what really spurred Calypso a lot. Trinidad now, you have a term they call, I'm going to sing a lavoué. A lavoué is like a call and response.
Okay.
Call and response is essentially comes out of the griot storytelling traditions of Africa.
Yes.
And what we added to it in the Caribbean with our own melodies and so on, own experiences. So there is a distinction has emerged, because what has happened, Andy, is that where Creole was being sort of not integrated in the early stages because of the urbanization, the strong urbanization of what is called the sort of classic Calypso. Right now, if you look at the structure of St. Lucia Calypso, you have some distinct patterns. And Creole, the melodies, and you have some strong proponents of these people like Educator, people like Wally, people like Ninctus, who are very strong proponents of that kind of combination, have dominated the Calypso scene.
Yes. And sometime back, Trinidad was very much a Creole society. I mean,
of course.
French and Creole used to be the dominant language.
Exactly.
So, which lends some credence to what you have just
and
discussed.
There's still lots of Creole. In fact, there's a resurgence of interest in Creole in Trinidad. And up to last September to November, FRC was part of a program run by an organization in Trinidad, and one of the courses was teaching of Creole, and it was highly subscribed. Yes. The University of the West Indies teaches Creole as a course at the university.
Wow.
Yeah.
The other takeaway I got from your book is that not only that folk music may have infused Calypso, but the way Calypso is organized, administered, maybe that was informed from the way in rural parts of the Caribbean, how people got together to celebrate using their folk music, entertainment, Lawas, Margaret, and so forth. It seems like the 10th. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I reckon I surmise that maybe that the whole 10th approach to Calypso administration and implementation was borrowed from our folk tradition.
Yes, I mean, there is no break in the development of society, as you would know, whether you study economics or you study politics or social development. So you find there's a continuum, and what people do is attempt to improve what has happened before and also make it more accessible. So definitely there's that infusion of these folk influences, the folk structure. I mean, if you know how a Lawas séance, a Lawas night, a Kutumba séance, a court night, and this researcher who worked with us for some time at the Folk Research Center, Jocelyn Guibault, who studied a lot of the folk music out of the South, particularly in Labrie and PI, really put that, stress that, all what we're seeing in terms of the formation of a distinct St. Lucian style of music is really rooted in our folk traditions.
All right. That's very interesting and exciting to me as somebody who I can say is a student of St. Lucian culture. So maybe the role our folk culture, our folk traditions, folk music, and so on. Maybe it has played a bigger role than we are thinking in our whole way of life. Even if we consider ourselves modern, and even if we are living, say, in Rodney Bay, far removed from the rural areas from which our folk traditions emerged.
Well, it's really about our values as well. I mean, even if we are modern, a lot of the core values of our society still remain. Respect for your neighbor, for each other, looking out for people, and so forth. I mean, there's of course in urban societies where you find, for instance, people don't have the amount of space you have in the rural areas. Behaviors have changed. I mean, even how you recycle stuff and so forth. Yeah. I mean, in our rural areas, people would not waste anything. Yeah. Everything was used. because, trying to address the issues of poverty that they were facing and so forth.
That's true.
But in the urban areas, it's slightly different. And you find that the dominance of influences through media by some of these values and practices from overseas now has, practically taken over most of our societies. So we are largely traditional societies in one way or another. And I think part of the problem we have is that our development models do not adequately embrace that and work on it. We just sort of wholesale parachute models down into our societies and think they will work. I mean, just recently you're listening to some economists discussing the budget and what, they essentially just referencing what we are doing here with models that exist overseas. Now, you can find behaviors and you can find patterns and so forth. But why not look at it carefully and say, well, let's see exactly what we are doing. A friend of mine, Cletus Springer, said recently that he finds that people in small islands tend to make management of our society so complicated. And it is not as complicated. He said, essentially, and it's always been my view, essentially you work with what you have. And as you strengthen your capacities, you reach out. But sometimes we forget what we have and we try to work with what we do not have. And hence we end up in problems of debt, in problems of all sorts of liabilities and all sorts of social issues that we face,
Well said. I think this is one of the accusations people made of Chasley. The whole idea of trying to impose wholesale what he saw overseas on St. Lucia, when our culture, our space, our society may not lend itself to this wholesale adaptation of foreign, what he saw in foreign lands.
Right.
Now, you touched on it, but I was a bit amazed that in the old days when Calypso was getting started, in the days of Terra, the educated and the upper class looked down on Calypso. They thought it was vulgar, gutter, vulgar activity, low class, and so on. Yet they they embraced Carnival and the Queen Show. Mm-hmm. So much so that the newspapers they would report the Carnival Queen in detail, mm-hmm. the Carnival Queen Show in detail, but they wouldn't even touch the Calypso competition. So what was wrong with Calypso? What was so bad about Calypso?
Well, as you correctly said, is where it came from. I mean, if you don't understand anything, it's very difficult to go and embrace it. And I think that was part of the problem. I mean, there was also the issue at that time. You had active social prejudices in the society, which in one way or another, you had to come to terms with. So the glamour, for instance, of say Carnival and the Calypso Queen and so forth was what attracted people. I mean, there was no glamour in Calypso. In fact, where you had Calypso shows happening was probably at the Union Hall by the market, where by the time you step outside, there was a stench of urine because people were peeing all over the place. But then, I mean, this was a form of release. This was a form of expression for people. This was a form of they themselves making editorial statements about what's happening in the society.
Yes. That
was their form. And then the upper class utilized their own form of, in terms of debates, they probably would be facilitated by the newspapers. Most of the editors used to either pull down stories out of the, as we call, out of the wire, and speaking about the war and who was, other activities globally. And there was a lot of debate about federation at the time.
Yes.
All of this was coming through the newspapers. And the ordinary local people were concerned with issues directly around them. So they sang about it, they ridicule their own self, they laugh at their own self, they laugh at their own jokes as a means of relief and so forth. And that lent itself to a lot of creativity.
Yeah.
And this came out of things like the court. This is what court is about. Court is about you in a society where something happens and then somebody just nous ka fait un court à monsieur, nous ka fait un court à c'est des moun ça mon boucher monsieur ka sort à kaisa nous ka fait un court. And then everybody added, there was a kind of extempo approach to court. Because as the song evolved, people added and they added and then out of that, the creative people emerged, and then you discovered the new ones. Okay. You discovered new chanteurs and chanteuses, because they started by listening, they started by participating, and this is what we need to encourage as much as possible in our art form. Once you identify the talent, is to provide the avenues to nurture that talent and give them a platform for them to grow.
Very true. In fact, your last statement is part of an article I've been writing on the culture and the youth economy. Culture as an engine of economic growth. But since you have moved, a related question to what you just touched on is the role. What is the definitive role of Calypso in St. Lucian society? But let me just one comment I have is that what I realize, given that, so Calypso basically became the voice of the uneducated masses, and it was their mouthpiece to participate, apparent, I think, in the political process, criticize the government, criticize the politicians, and criticize the ills of society. So to me, if this is so, I would say Calypso helped strengthen our democracy.
Certainly. I think any opportunity for people to demonstrate their concerns, for people to share their own views on a matter, really strengthens democracy. Democracy is really about the feedback from people, participation of people, and so forth. So I think it is important to understand that at that point in time, especially using Creole language and the local English vernacular, that people were able to express themselves in the language they are competent in.
Yes.
And though at the time sometimes the authorities did not understand, but they came to understand eventually, because their success relied on the support of these people, especially after adult suffrage. Before, it didn't matter, because a lot of people were not enfranchised to vote. But following adult suffrage, then this support mattered. So you had to understand what they were saying.
And they had to pay more attention to the Calypso.
Definitely.
I want to get back to what you just said, but I think I need to make an announcement. Roof Tropics Media will be collaborating with Trinidad and Tobago online radio station, Our Culture, Our Vibes.com, in which our Creole La Force AP Kuwai morning show, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Monday to Friday, will be teaching their listeners how to speak and write Creole. All right. The point I wanted to make has slipped me. But what surprises me is that they would disdain Calypso and fall for Carnival and the Queen Show. But for me, the aspect of the whole Carnival enterprise, that I find most compelling, intriguing, uplifting, is Calypso. Its message, commentary, its drama, its theater, its play on words, its raising of consciousness. So when I read that in your book that they were disdaining Calypso, it was slightly surprising.
Well, if you study the history of Calypso in Trinidad, this is so paramount, because writers like Gordon Rollet, like people like Roll Gibbons, who studied Calypso a lot and did a lot of work in terms of presenting Calypso through theater, through academic courses. All of these threads were there. The description of the kind of what they call Mauvelang and Jamet behavior in the tense. You had to sort of cordon off these people in a certain section, so that kind of language doesn't escape the area and influence the ears of the subtle and the ears of the sophisticated. So that's in some people say that's how the tense emerged in Trinidad. by putting a tent and then putting thing around it, like, whether it's pie cocoa and so forth, and confine them to that space so they can behave as much as they want in there. But of course, this evoked curiosity. And that's where the others started coming in and started eventually giving support to it.
Yeah, and eventually
dominating it and taking it over.
And after a while, everybody wanted to be in the tent.
Exactly.
Because that's where all the excitement was.
Exactly.
Whether you were elite or not.
Exactly. That's where things happen,
Now, you mentioned another thing that struck my attention in the book is that I think you mentioned that in the rural areas, the out districts, they were so steeped in their folk culture, folk music, their Lawas and La Magritte tradition, that they were so engrossed with that there was less of a need for them to adopt calypso and foreign music. Mm-hmm. As a result, for a long while, calypso did not take much hold in the rural areas.
Yeah.
So the thought that arises is that our folk culture is, to some extent, was protecting us from foreign invasion.
Well, that's except that calypso itself was not technically foreign, because we had our own growth of indigenous calypso forms. It is really morphed out of, as I said, some of our folk traditions. But there were two things happening there. One is that the language. I mean, if calypso was perceived as being sung in English, most of our folk people at the time, I mean, Creole was the dominant language they had their own folk forms that was doing similar things with calypso.
Yeah.
It was bringing people together. There were times of festivity. I mean, if you compare like a Lawas to a carnival, you had the glamour of the Guanfet in a Lawas after all the seances of practices, which is equivalent to the tents, building up to the big yard.
Yes.
And then you had, creative people come, there was one thing about it, there was not the kind of stringent competition in the rural areas as it is in calypso. And that itself is another issue we can discuss as to what has been the impact of competition in calypso and by extension in our arts.
Good or bad?
Well, I think it has had some good, but bad in a sense that it mirrored the same competitive stream in other sectors of our society, where naturally, it's almost not even structurally, it roots out a number of people. You just look at our education system. It's apex. You have some brilliant students coming out of primary schools who, because of the nature of will never make it to a university. Except in recent times when you have had things like universal secondary education, and recently with the Labour Party government speaking about ensuring you have one graduate for each household. But before that, it was so structured that I know when I went to St. Mary's College, I know some of the brightest students around me. Everybody would have got your 5 or 6 O-levels.
Yes.
But one person probably didn't get a high grade in a particular subject, but did have the 5. But there were limited spaces at the A-level college.
Yes.
So he had to find something else to do. So he probably went into agriculture, or he probably went into something else because there was an opportunity there. Ended up being brilliant agriculturists as well, and also managers. But what would have happened if there was space that he could have gone in that A-level college with the same batch of us, expanding the pool, and of course giving them a natural opportunity to go to university at the time all of us went.
Yes.
And some of them would have gone a little later because they had to find other means of matriculation and getting to the university and so forth. So using that as, by way of an example, what's happening to calypso, consider, Andy, in a normal good season of calypso, if you have, say on average, because sometimes we have had as many as 5 or 6 tents in a season.
Yes.
On a normal season, let's say you have 3 or at most 4 tents. Each tent produces, on average, about 20 calypsos. Now, we may argue about the quality of what comes out, but the fact is that you have 20 compositions. So you have between 60 and 80 compositions every season. not every year, every season.
Season.
And the season is limited to a few weeks, actually. Out of that, 9 make it to the finals. 1 wins. The winner takes all. Of course, you have a second, third runner-up prize. The winner takes all. The winner's 2 songs become somewhat the playable songs. Let's assume out of that 9, say 6, their songs have some traction.
Yes.
So you have 12 songs out of 80 songs in one season.
Getting attention, and everybody else has just disappeared into the wilderness. Yeah.
Now, we are arguing that Calypso should be year-round and so forth and let people compose more. But if we're arguing that, that means more songs will be produced. Unless we create the opportunity.
More songs will be discarded.
Precisely. Unless we create the opportunity for more people to be in the forefront and to be highlighted, then you'll have more disenchantment, more people come in and saying, boy, what's the point of going in there? If I don't win, that's the end of life for me. And then, incidentally, if I'm ridiculed on the stage, it's even worse because nobody will look at me again. So that kind of structure of competition, that is the sort of downside of it, in my view.
Yes.
I mean, people argue about the upside forces you to be more creative, more talented.
Yes.
But it also, what happens, resources follow people who are successful.
Yes.
And those who are marginally or perceived not to be, it doesn't follow them.
And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It becomes almost like a cyclical process.
Yeah.
So they become successful all the time. And then, so we need to look at how it is managed, or else you
have raised some very interesting points. Let me make just a couple of observations. In terms of the example you gave, in terms of school education, we were made to think that it is because our resources are scarce, we are poor, so we cannot have enough spaces for everybody to go to A-level, everybody to go to even secondary school. And that notion is questionable, but if resources were actually scarce and we just couldn't send everybody to A-level who wanted to go, then there would need to be a process of selection.
Mm-hmm.
But how true that is debatable, because all along I thought we did not have enough resources for everybody to go to secondary school. But in came Kenny Anthony's Labour Party in 1997 and made secondary school attendance universal. So much so that today we have an overcapacity in secondary school education. We have more seats than we have students. Mm-hmm. But all before that, we were told we were too poor. So that made me wonder how far back we could have had universal secondary school education. But we didn't, because there wasn't the desire and the will.
Right.
Not necessarily there wasn't sufficient resources.
Exactly.
So these are my two.
But just to add to your comment, though, if you recall, there was a time when most of the main secondary schools had their own sixth form.
Yes.
And then it was, around the time it was moved to the A-level college where all sixth form happened. There was a lot of debate as to whether this was a good step or a bad step. Yeah. And the argument at the time, of course, you marshal the best resources into one location. But as a lot of other educators have been saying, get the proper resources to each of these schools.
Yes.
So you bring up everybody at the same time, So you would have a lot of more people doing the A-levels, matriculating, going on to university, exactly. And then, you have a wider pool of people. And of course, the next step would be make sure that the society is prepared for them in terms of jobs and so forth. Yeah,
well said. And this works very well, especially for, say, I'm from Beaufort, so especially if, say, you're from Beaufort, before to attend A-level, you have to go to school in Castries.
Right.
And this can be a very challenging proposition, especially back then, given what obtained as far as the transportation system. So for the out districts, that was a brilliant idea to turn some of the secondary schools to A level. Not necessarily all of them, but if you have one in Vieux-Fort, maybe West Coast. So to make it much easier for people to attend A level. And I think this is what has happened. And I think the country, no one now will argue it wasn't a good idea. Now, you mentioned language. That's the other thing that piqued my attention in your book, because you said the Calypsonians and Calypso led the way in using the full range of St. Lucia's linguistic palette, which you mentioned was Standard English, English Creole, and Creole or French or French Creole.
Right.
And long before the establishments and long before the government and so forth, the Calypsonians were making full use of that full range of linguistic palette that we have in St. Lucia. So in yet another way, the Calypsonians were leading the way
in policy making. Yes. No, I mean, I'm glad you raised it, because it's an area in the book that I would like to see develop much further than the way I essentially introduced it. And I wanted to establish it very early as a foundational fact in the book, because people are of the view that, okay, there are some disadvantages of using the Creole language in a competitive situation. Now, sometimes you have change being forced from beneath.
Yeah.
And this is a case in point. You probably don't follow Calypso as I do. But going to Calypso tents, and some of the observations made about people who are selected to judge Calypso. And you know people at the tent sometimes, make comments about people maybe highly uninformed and say, but how this person on judging, and then Hita coming to sing and Hita have a Creole. How this person will understand what Hita is saying? There was one year, Andy, when we had a judge. I remember, I think it was, it must have been King Obstinate out of Antigua, who was a judge but we have had in the past, judges from other Caribbean countries,
yes,
where they do not speak Creole. And you have in the finals people who are singing, not at that time full Creole songs, but with significant lines in Creole. And the question is how fair it is to that person being judged by someone who doesn't understand what they're saying.
Yes.
Because imagine somebody speaking to you in English, and then in the middle of the conversation, the person introduces a sentence in Arabic or in Hebrew, and goes back to English. Obviously, there's a break.
You miss out on.
You miss out on something. So there's something. So the same thing could have happened with the use of Creole.
Yes.
So in that case, there was a lot of angst among some of the Calypso fans, especially the supporters of these Calypsonians who sang Creole. When somebody like Hita came very early, I don't know if there's a guy called a Mighty Hita, a farmer, and he did the song entirely in Creole. And of course, Hita didn't make it to the finals, not necessarily because he sang in Creole. Probably his song wasn't probably the best composition to make it to a final.
Yeah.
But the argument was, could Hita has had any chance of making it to the final? Good question. But thereafter, you had all sorts of tinkling with dropping a Creole line in a song, using a Creole verse, and a Creole chorus and an English verse, all that kind of interplay. It is okay if these songs are there for public consumption without competition.
Yes.
Because you like a song, You'll buy it or you'll play it as much as you want because there's no restrictions on you. You don't have to satisfy any criteria to once you understand the song. Sometimes you may not even understand the Creole, but it rings out, it resonates with you, you go with it. But when it comes to competition, that's a different matter.
Yes.
Because people have invested so much. And if, for instance, there's unfair treatment, you're saying something about your treatment of your own language, the Creole language. So that emerged especially in 1997 when Educator did the song called Letla.
Yeah.
Letla was entirely Creole. Of course, Educator won that year. But it established that whether we like it or not, we have to accept a full Creole song in a competition and judge it.
Yeah.
And judge it. So training of judges now has to incorporate your ability to understand Creole. Now, recently, and by way of a little diversion, there's a group called run by Karen Tobier doing a competition called Chante Creole.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
In addition to singing, they have to submit the script in the written Creole, which is a positive development for our language.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not even talking about folk research, but for our language as a society. So there is a second level of understanding of our language, the written form.
Yeah.
So it's forcing our policymakers now to stop pussyfooting about establishing language
in our schools
and formality of language as Creole as a language. Yes. You know, this has been our major problem in terms of Creole in St. Lucia. Not that the people do not want it, but for some kind of spurious reasons, policymakers always talk about, and sometimes influenced by a lot of uninformed advisors.
Yes.
About whether it's going to keep our society back, whether it's going to, the kind of resources we need to apply to it. We don't have enough resources. We don't have sufficient a body of literature for people to study. But literature will be created once you have that, you know. So I think one has to be very, very particular and very careful about how we treat our Creole language. And just to finish the point about the use of the language spectrum in our society, you have Calypsonians who code switch. I mean, they start singing in English, they go to St. Lucian English Creole vernacular, and they go to the St. Lucian to Creole, and it creates a very complex arrangement for one to judge.
Yeah,
you know, I mean. Sometimes people have been saying, even when Denry segment emerged, whether there should be a separate competition for Denry segment because of what they thought is the uniqueness of the use of the Creole and the rhythm. Now the rhythm doesn't change. So what you'll be judging is the use of language, essentially.
Yes, very interesting. What you just said there suggests another maybe disadvantage of competition. It can force the art form to take certain directions that may not be the best. Now, in your book, back to your book, because your book provided a lot of food for thought, as you are seeing. Somewhere in your book, it is stated that Carnival was the strongest link in the West Indian Federation chain. And it hinted that it wasn't surprising that Jamaica was the territory that initiated the breakup of the West Indian Federation, because it was the only territory in the Federation without organized carnival, implying that devoid of carnival, Jamaica couldn't fully appreciate the importance and necessity of federation. So then, we have touched on what is the significance of Calypso to St. Lucian society, and we have been discussing what role has Calypso been playing in St. Lucian and West Indian society. We have been touching on this. But the Prime Minister, though, has been speaking about bolstering our national identity, protecting and preserving our patrimony and cultural heritage. Have Calypso been helping to shape and strengthen our national identity, our sense of nationhood?
Oh, certainly, Andy. I mean, as we just spoke of a while ago, the use of the Creole language, which is a critical marker of a St. Lucian identity, what we would call the linguists would call the active, not just passive, the active competence in a language. Your ability to speak and create thoughts in that language. And that, I mean, a lot of the rural people who, we are not probably competent in English.
Yes.
Are very competent in Creole. These are the St. Lucians who would... That is the link between your past and your future, because they carry the stories that are not written in books. And even if their story is written by other people, it is not ours. It is the people's interpretation of our stories.
Yes.
Because in many cases, they would write, they would ask a question and they would write what they think somebody is saying, and they may get an interpreter who may not be the best interpreter at the time. So when you allow these people to document their stories in their language, and then eventually those of us who and the linguists who have more competent in the language can translate, you get a better sense of your history.
Yes.
So I think Calypso has certainly, especially in its use of our folk melodies, in its use of our language, and in its ability to like Trinidad, to really articulate our own social, historical, and cultural experiences, is really fundamental to contributing to our identity.
True. I think I couldn't have said it any better. Now we have 9 more minutes, but I think we can run through.
Yeah, that's okay.
Maybe I think we have touched on the things that probably require more lengthy discussion, but
yeah, we could always do it some other time.
Yeah. Well, the Mighty Sparrow is regarded as the world's all-time king of Calypso.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest Calypsonian who have ever lived. I think that's the consensus. I don't know if I'm wrong. In your book, you reported that in Terra's Calypso tribute to Pele at his passing in 2011, he said that Pele was the greatest man in Calypso in St. Lucia history. Notwithstanding, who you reckon is the greatest Calypsonian St. Lucia has produced?
Well, Andy, when people ask questions about being the best, I always, feel that you must have some criteria.
Here comes the competition again.
Exactly. Here comes a competition, and you need criteria. It's like asking who's St. Lucia's best prime minister. You may ask who's St. Lucia's longest serving prime minister. This is a simple question to answer. It's either A or B. Who is St. Lucia's worst prime minister might be, if you use some criteria, it might be easy to say as well. Who's St. Lucia's worst prime minister. But when you come to the creative arts, and then you say, well, who is the best? There's an issue of longevity,
Yes.
which I think is certainly a factor.
Yes.
Because it speaks to a lot of consistency. Because the fact that you survive for so long, it means that you have been able to produce material that people embrace for a long period of time without disappointing them.
Yes.
There's also the other factor of your ability to operate in other spheres of the art form. Pele, unlike Terra, and maybe not because of anything happening to the Terra's own lack of ability, Pele transcended all the forms of the Calypso art form.
Yes.
He did the groovy, he did the soca. Pele was a consummate writer. Pele was an administrator as well. Pele won the crown many times, and I think Pele certainly stands out as one of our greatest Calypsonian. Now there are those who are still alive. One may argue that you can't count them out, but up to this point in time, who is the greatest Calypsonian that we have produced? And you have to be a bit dispassionate, because
Yes.
the most popular may not necessarily be the greatest. And again, if you have to apply criteria, one has to agree. Here's a competition again,
Yes.
and we go. But I think Terra was correct in even at this early stage
Yeah.
in assessing Pele's contribution to Calypso in St. Lucia.
Pele would be my
Your pick.
my pick. Yes, because I think his impact and his impact everywhere. People living in diaspora. And that Christmas Carol album.
Yeah.
I
That's
think was probably stamped it for him. I think.
right.
But let me move on. Of course, we know that Trinidad is the mecca of Carnival, Calypso, and Soca. It has the largest and probably most spectacular carnival in the Caribbean, if not the world. And it has produced many of the region's most renowned Calypsonians and Soca artists. But how does St. Lucia, another competition again, how does St. Lucian Calypsonians compare with that of Trinidad and the other islands? Where is St. Lucia ranked in terms of Calypso?
Ranked, you mean in the Caribbean, in the world, or
Yeah, compare
with
the
Trinidad?
standard of calypso in St. Lucia compared with the standard in Trinidad, Barbados, Antigua, the other islands.
No, I think Calypso,
where do we stand?
Calypso pound for pound, I think we stand very close to Trinidad in terms of what Trinidad has. Trinidad has a wider range, a wider variety. They have more Calypsonians, but I think if you look at the development of the art form in terms of the quality of lyrics, the quality of composition, a St. Lucian Calypso can stand up to a Trinidad Calypso.
Okay.
I mean, Pep took part in the Calypso King of the World and placed. Okay. Invader has taken part in international competitions and placed. So if from a competition point of view, we can pick out some of our best, and they are side by side with Trinidad's best. You go in the area of soca, same thing. You could pick out our best. They are side by side with Trinidad's best. The thing about Trinidad, the Calypso community or the Calypso space in Trinidad can be very parochial at points in time. You probably won't remember, but there was a time when the Barbadians invaded Trinidad with a lot of the popular songs at the time and the popular artists like Yearwood, like Rupee, like Alison Hines, and it ruffled the feathers of Trinidad. There was a time when Lodge Short Shirt from Antigua. There's still the argument in Trinidad that the song Short Shirt song Tourist Lego that was played by a pan in Trinidad did not win. A Trinidadian saying that, because Short Shirt was not a Trinidadian and the song wasn't a Trini song.
Yes.
So all the Caribbean countries, including St. Lucia, you can pick out our best, and they stand side by side with Trinidad's best.
So you are saying we are second to Trinidad?
Well, I'm not too sure. I don't think I wouldn't say second, but at certain times we could have been second, depending on what genre you're talking
so
about.
We are in the top three.
Well, I think so. I mean, if you're forcing me to say,
Okay. I think we have time for maybe one more, unless if you say you have to leave at.
Well, I could spend a couple of 5 more minutes.
Okay. Because in the promo we said we're going to talk about the state of health of St. Lucian Calypso. To me, it appears that the younger generation prefers soca to calypso, and worldwide, I could be wrong. Worldwide, soca seems to have gained much greater popularity than calypso. So tell me, what is the state of health of St. Lucian Calypso? Is it a dying art form?
No, I don't think it's dying. It's as simple as that. I don't think it's dying. As I used my statistic earlier on, if we're still able to produce so many compositions in a year, definitely a lot of them do not reach the light of day because of the competitive situation. But I don't think it's dying.
I don't know what gave me that impression. Not that it's dying, but its popularity is falling. Well, but I could be wrong because I'm not as
no. Andy, when you use any kind of measurement criteria, let's assume 10 years ago you had 3 football teams in a competition, and then you will argue that this single football team, after the next 4 years, you do not you get about a 5 more. That one football team which dominated 10 years ago is probably less dominant because you have a wider pool now of people coming into the art form. What has happened with people talk about dominance of the dying of calypso and so forth, because it's becoming, because you have more things competing for people's attention now.
Oh, yeah, true.
That it appears that but calypso people who follow calypso will continue to follow calypso.
Yes.
They will spend some time doing other things or listening to other types of music, but they will follow calypso. So because we have much more on the horizon, it appears that what used to be so big when they were less on the horizon looks much smaller now.
Yes.
So that, I think that is that's the only kind of analogy I can bring up to explain that.
Is it continuing to attract the young generation?
Well,
What
if it wasn't continuing, we wouldn't have a Calypso season. And it is. I mean, we're not satisfied with the rate at which it's continuing because, again, I mentioned the sort of streaming out. We have always argued for some kind of system which keeps the young people from school to the big yard, to the tents.
Yes.
That is where they drop out. Because when they leave school, they can be, unless, a tent recruits them immediately out of school, which is good and bad, then they drop out.
Yes.
They do not gain the interest or the support to get back in when they reach the age of 16. We have lots of controversies in the past about whether somebody's too young to enter the finals. And all these other things have not done well for encouraging young people to go into Calypso.
Do we still have inter-primary school competition, inter-secondary school Calypso competitions?
We still do.
Still going on?
We still do.
I mentioned that because, again, from your book, St. Mary's College was one of the first mainstream institutions or establishments to embrace Calypso, and as such was instrumental in advancing Calypso as a St. Lucian art form. In fact, it was a cradle, a Calypso cradle, because people like Terra, I think you said Pele,
Zando,
Pep, all these people came
Bingo.
from... Yeah. And early on, before the government, before a lot of other establishments, the college was supporting and encouraging their students in doing Calypso. If all this is true, then maybe one way to grow the Calypso as an enterprise is to make sure we have Calypsos in schools.
Yeah.
And one way to generate that kind of interest, the competition again, primary school competition, secondary school competition, and have it well structured and pair the young people with coaches, writers, and so forth. In other words, groom them from that early age.
Yeah.
And if you have the competitions and so on in schools, then not only the kids participating in the competition, but the whole school will get energized and excited, and then they may continue following Calypso as they become adults.
But even more fundamentally, Andy, is to encourage and also make it policy that from the primary school age, it's mandatory that a student does art. When I mean art in a general sense.
Yes.
Music or some form of the creative arts as a subject going right through. Because just imagine you have a class, a standard 3 or what is called now in our modern language, where some students doing music, some doing literature and composition, and some of them doing theater. And at the end of the class season or the end of the term, individual A writes a song for individual B to sing, because that one is a good performer, but this one is a sound lyricist, and this other one can create can do the melody and the arrangement. I mean, imagine these things happening and that kind of arranged, association blossoming beyond their school years into adulthood, and maybe that's how a lot of school bands are formed in the early stages. I mean, a few friends got together because this one was good at the keyboard because he was doing piano exercises, and this one maybe just naturally talented, started playing drums or hitting the drum, and then they came together, they formed a school band, and then they started performing, and then they stayed beyond that and then blossomed into an adult band, and they went into music professionally.
True.
So we need to have more of that.
Yeah, I have a good example of that in Vieux-Fort at the Vieux-Fort Secondary School. Mayoni Ogier has been the music teacher for years.
Yeah.
And almost all musicians now operating in the South, Vieux-Fort, Belleville, Labrie, most of the musicians came through his program.
Yes.
They are on cruise ships. They are,
exactly.
For example, Shomari, Monty Maxwell's son, has 2 free bands. He's a top keyboard player.
He's an entrepreneur as well.
He's an entrepreneur, and so forth.
And influence of people like Monty in the South as well. I mean, shouldn't forget that.
Big Bang?
Monty's own influence in the South.
Well, yes, and again, Monty and them came out of the Viewfort Secondary School program of I think there was a Trinidadian who came down to teach them pan.
Exactly.
And they gravitated to having a pan band at Halcyon days and so forth. So I think our schools, besides academics, there is a lot of good that can come out of our schools if things are structured, if we are willing to give the kids the attention
and the opportunities. Well. Yeah.
Now, as you mentioned, in a school program of the arts, because really Calypso embraces the full range of the arts, because in a Calypso competition, you have backdrops, you have actors,
you have
you
art,
have costume,
you have theater,
design, you have theater. So maybe a simple thing like having a Calypso at the schools and teaching arts can stimulate the whole cultural industry in St. Lucia. Now, this brings me to one of my thoughts I've had for a while now, because I've always thought by the way, in terms of entertainment, I've never been to any show in any part of the world that provides more entertainment value than the Calypso finals.
Well, that's good to hear from you.
I've been to shows in the US, different places. I just haven't seen anything that gives me the amount of entertainment value that fills me up when I live there as Calypso finals. So this is why I thought, well, I've seen Calypso as theater in the manner that opera is theater, but Calypso being even more dramatic than opera. Am I pronouncing that right? The storytelling, the elaborate props and backdrops, the actors on stage foreshadowing the theme of the Calypso are all salient features of Calypso finals. So my question is, would Calypso reach a wider international audience if it is presented and marketed as theater, as theatrical shows?
If it would reach a wider audience, I mean...
For example, we in New York and duplicate what is done at the finals, the whole theater and so on, especially if it is a theme that is international in scope, that not peculiar to St. Lucia. I'm wondering whether that will make Calypso more marketable. Just a thought.
Well, the question is marketing towards what end? I mean, because you can market things, but what you're marketing things for. Everybody feels, well, there should be more money made out of Calypso. I think naturally the Calypsonians should be better rewarded and there should be more revenue generated. But I think we have to think through that. Just simply a question of saying you make it marketable for the international audience. When you do things like that, if the international audience is a demand and supply situation, they demand certain things to the Calypso for them to consume it. It means it's forces you to change the Calypso.
That's true.
Now, what you have to ensure is that the universal components, as you mentioned, of the Calypso is clearly presented, whether it is the music, the theatrical part, all of the values of theater are clearly presented, so somebody can actually enjoy a performance without even necessarily understanding the exact lyrics itself.
Yes.
So in that sense, you have to ensure that the Calypso performer moves around the world. But it doesn't work like that. It's the Calypso song moves around the world more than the performer. This is where the challenge is to make that song without the performer marketable enough. And what makes a song successful without the performer certainly is the potency of the lyrics of that song as a Calypso. Yes. And because Calypsos by and large respond to a lot of environmental issues. When I don't mean environment in terms of natural, but social, political. That's what gives the Calypso its power, its strength. And once these social issues can can be replicated. If somebody sings a song about black power now, that can resonate with what's happening in the USA with racism and so forth.
That is true.
Yeah. So it's for the Calypso to make some of these choices as to what they sing, if it is in their view that is what they want to be out there. But because the nature of our Calypso fraternity, it is still by and large a side job for them. I mean, there are very few Calypsonians around who are full time, and even in Trinidad, people think there are lots of top Calypsonians in Trinidad who have another job. And then they just hone their craft afterwards. So there's something keeping them going that permits them to invest more in the arts, and as a result they can go overseas and so forth. So the fundamental issue, we have to find out what we're trying to solve if we're talking about marketing Calypso more. Are we trying to solve a problem of lack of revenue or lack of income, or problem of popularity, before we apply a solution? Because otherwise we can apply a solution that might be totally counterproductive to what we're trying to solve.
Yes, the point is well taken. For example, by trying to make Calypso more broadly appealing, it may move away from what it gives to our society.
Exactly.
What it does for us as a society.
What it means for us as a society.
The national identity, and so on. So then we may have an art form that is, as far as we are concerned, is empty, because it doesn't really
come out of us.
Exactly. And cater to us.
Exactly.
And so forth. So I agree. We probably need to be careful
as to is what we're trying to solve. That's the question.
Because we have to ask ourselves what is art.
Exactly.
And what is art for.
Yeah.
And so on. So that point is well taken. But I have an let me
wrap up.
No, not wrap up. We have it seems like we a few more minutes.
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. Okay. Maybe I need to commend you on the book.
Thank you.
As I told you before, I had never heard of Terra, much less been aware of his dominance and the pioneering role he played in Lucian and Calypso. This points to the importance of, as you were saying before, of writing our own history, documenting our milestones, recording and giving artistic expression to our culture. Our first and only comprehensive history of St. Lucia is written largely by a Dutch national, for which, mind you, I'm very grateful. But how do we expect our young people to be proud of their country, to be proud to be St. Lucians, to have a strong sense of national identity, if they are unaware of their history and the accomplishments of those who came before them? Therefore, I must commend you on your book. But Terra is only one of many great St. Lucian Calypsonians. So I think you shouldn't stop there.
No, I'm not stopping there.
How about another book devoting, say, a chapter to each of our great Calypsonians? For example, all the crown winners, and also some of those who are great Calypsonians but never won a crown. I think this will make this... In your book, in this book, you have established the foundation. So I think from there
is to move up.
You can move, yeah.
Well, and it's really the book was designed also to be like a chapter 1, so to speak, of the history of Calypso, and out of that you have different manifestations of where we go. What we've had discussions is doing a compendium of Calypso monarchs as a teaching tool for schools as a start. So you have all of these the monarchs with their bio, and hopefully select some of the songs. We'll discuss the styles of Calypso and approach to Calypso. Yes. So out of that, all of the issues which I raised in the book will emerge out of that second project. And I've also had some discussions with a couple of other Calypsonians in terms of helping write their stories as well. So there it's not ending there.
Great.
It takes a lot of time because, I mean, we have a serious dearth of records in our society. People, Calypsonians sometimes sing a song and they don't even have a copy of the song that they sang the year.
Yeah.
So you have to try and get them to sing it and then transcribe it. And then the other thing is that,
And
people
not having RSL around it.
Well, yeah, because that was the challenge we had with getting some of the recordings of Terra. Terra's recordings may have been done by somebody called Martin Elwin, who was the engineer at Radio Central, very early stages.
Yeah.
And of course, you know the story.
Yes.
But certainly we will. We are working on continuing that documentation and encouraging others to do it. Anybody who needs the assistance, FRCs will be willing to give the assistance to help them write their stories about the art, about Calypso. And
So
so
you all might commission books.
well, certainly.
Well, I think it's a great idea. I can make suggestions going forward.
Oh yes, you as a writer yourself, you can be part of that.
I think I'm told we have just 1 more minute. So, Mr. Embert Charles, it was a pleasure. I think I learned quite a lot about Calypso and the whole history of Calypso from reading the book and from our discussion.
Thank you.
So thanks very much for making it to the show. And by the way, how are your? I know they say St. Lucians don't read, and now we have really no traditional bookstores around. So how is your sales and marketing coming along?
We had an initial push in the first month or two where, of course, lots of people, but I think it's been like most books, as you are a bookseller yourself, so it's been very sort of measured and slow. But we're hoping that we could seize the opportunity with the revival of the Calypso season this year to get some of these back on. And FRC is also intending to get back into its annual magazine publication every season.
And what about the diaspora? Because one of the ways Roof Tropics Media is trying to distinguish itself from the other media houses is to cater and focus on the diaspora.
Well,
so any plans for the diaspora in terms of book signings, book activities, any initiatives in the works as far as FRC is concerned?
Well, if we have the resources like you have to launch in the US, we'll certainly do it. But we have a contact, Gregory Regis in Toronto, who is helping us sell. We actually have a stock of books up there with him.
Cool.
So Canadians who are in the Toronto metropolitan area can actually contact him and get their copies.
Yes, I think FRC can have a whole series of a book series.
Yeah,
and because institutions like FRC is better positioned to raise funds from the corporate world and so forth. I think than individuals like me. They don't look at me twice.
But fundraising for cultural organizations is really difficult.
It's tough.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to tell your audience anything about your book or last minute words.
Well, I think just to essentially ask people to if they need a copy, and I suggest that they get a copy. I think the one of the things you didn't mention is we have a sort of a appendix in the book which gives you a listing of all people who we can recall have sung Calypso from 1956 until 2019 when we had a COVID break.
Yes.
And all the tents, the bands, so that kind of basic information that you can use, especially if you're in an argument to establish bragging rights and so forth.
That's true. I found out that we have at least 24 Calypso
monarchs. Yeah.
So
we have all of that, and it's available at the Folk Research Center, or people could contact me and I can get it. We are up to this point. We can get it autographed by Terra as well.
Okay. Yes. Now, I'm so glad that Terra is still alive.
Yes.
Because we have our Dead Hero Society syndrome. So I'm glad he's still there and still, can enjoy.
And that we were able to launch the book in his presence as well.
Yes. So I thought that was very good. Yes. So listeners, folks, thanks very much for tuning in on Roof Tropics Media and Conversations with Dr. Anderson Reynolds. It was a pleasure. I hope you learned as much as I did about Calypso and the history of Calypso. Thank you very much, and have a great weekend.